Award from the Clear Loose Policy Institute. So, he's going to talk about the Second Amendment. So, please help me welcome Katie Pavlich.
Well, welcome. Is this high enough? Can you hear me?
Can you turn? I may have not turned it on. It should be on.
Better? Better? Testing.
I'm not hearing you.
You all can check it.
Is it? You see a number 4 on the front? Turn it around.
No, it says 3.
Okay. Turn it up. Here. I'll just make sure. Sorry.
Compressor always uses the little ones that are sitting on you.
Testing.
Yeah, there it is.
Much better, right? Yeah, better? All right. Cool. Well, sorry we're late. I flew in from Arizona this morning, so I've been flying all day, which is fun. First of all, I want to thank Bethany Bora and Young America's Foundation for having me here today and putting this event together. I also understand there are some Democrats in the crowd. You want to make yourself good? Okay. Well, I want to thank you for coming because I think that it's really important to embrace free speech on college campuses and to embrace this idea that we can exchange ideas in a tolerant fashion and be open to each other's perspectives regardless of our political affiliation going into an event. So I want to applaud you for coming here today and being tolerant and open to new ideas that maybe you'll disagree with, but at least you'll understand different perspective when you leave here today. So I want to go over just a little bit about what Young America's Foundation does in terms of what they provide for students. They sponsor the event today, obviously, but they also provide students with the tools that they need around the country to fight for the things that they believe in on their college campuses. And as I briefly just went over, college campuses are ground zero when it comes to free speech and fighting for the free flow of different ideas. And I think that Young America's Foundation and the students that participate in their programs play a crucial role in protecting the rights of not just conservative students on campus, but of students, all students on campus. So I've been asked today to talk about the Second Amendment, which is an issue that is near and dear to my heart. It's something that I've written a lot about, something I've been heavily involved in for a couple of years now. And it really has been just part of my life growing up. So we'll get started with what we're going to do in terms of covering that. So just giving you a little bit of my background. You know, everybody has a different background when it comes to what their experiences are with the Second Amendment, what their experiences are with firearms. And I grew up just in an environment where firearms were something that was part of our life on a daily basis. It wasn't a scary thing. It was something that was respected, just like parents teach their kids not to, drink the bleach under the sink and not to go outside in the pool when there's not an adult around. We were taught to do the same when it came to firearms and not touching them when you were a child. And in a broader context, it was really about family. So my mom learned how to shoot from my grandpa, who was an advocate for the Second Amendment his entire life, and more specifically for the National Rifle Association. And my dad is a big firearms guru who taught me how not only to shoot, but also how to hunt. And for my 11th birthday, he bought me my first deer rifle and had my name inscribed in cursive on the gunsling, which was, I thought, one of the coolest gifts I've ever received. And the next year I went hunting for the first time, and I think all of my male cousins were a little bit jealous, and I was the only one who came home with a deer that year. But I learned the moral of this is that I learned at a young age how to respect firearms and their capability. So while my experience with firearms and the Second Amendment comes from my family, there's also the other side of this in terms of me growing up in America, right? So my passion about the Second Amendment and firearms is also deeply rooted in U.S. history and my love for this country. People forget that American settlers were here for a long time, nearly 200 years, and loyal to the King of England before the American Revolution started. That's a lot of time. 200 years is nothing to sneeze at, considering how young the country really is today. So the question becomes, why after so long did English rule come to an end? And why did the American Revolution start? And there's a number of reasons, as I'm sure many of you have studied, but essentially, it started over two main things: taxes and firearms confiscation. We all know about the Boston Tea Party, but some of you might not know about Williamsburg, Virginia. On the night of April 20th, 1775, in colonial Williamsburg, under the rule of King George III at the time, the action of the British governor removing gunpowder belonging to the colony touched off revolution in Virginia. And for this reason, the Second Amendment was written and solidified as part of our nation's most important document, the U.S. Constitution. The Second Amendment is an issue that is constantly being debated. What are its limits? Some go so far as asking even why it's necessary. So first, let's go over what the Second Amendment actually says. A well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. Now, the Second Amendment was written into the Bill of Rights as a way to prevent tyranny. Because after all, an armed society is a polite society. I love how gun-grabbing politicians like Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama jump at the chance to arm rebels in countries like Libya and Syria, but for some reason have an issue with the American people, the so-called rebels, being armed. But politicians like Hillary Clinton and Obama aren't the only ones who don't make much sense on the issue, and they definitely aren't the ones free from hypocrisy. I work in media, so a lot of their friends in the media are also guilty of this issue. Take, for example, former CNN anchor Piers Morgan. So here's a guy who has armed guards and security, and who used to work in a building protected 24 hours a day by armed guards. And I'm proud to say that Piers once publicly called me America's dimmest pundit. But the thing is that I still have a job, and he doesn't. Not to mention, Americans don't want to deport me, and I actually have friends in England, unlike Piers. Piers Morgan would prefer that all guns be banned for the rest of us, while he lives in a protected bubble. Piers often forgets that we kicked out the British with guns in 1776, saved the British in 1812 with guns, and then saved them again in 1941. So I don't think that we'll be giving them up anytime soon. Michael Moore, who of course used to be a guest on Piers' show, is a documentary filmmaker and became famous when he made a documentary about the evils of guns, and yet his bodyguard was arrested in 2005 on gun charges. In a desperate attempt to be funny, actor Jim Carrey is more than happy to make crude jokes about law-abiding citizens and to paint gun owners as stupid rednecks not willing to save children, yet has publicly admitted he has armed protection outside of his Hollywood home 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and 365 days out of the year. Former NBC Meet the Press anchor David Gregory scoffed at the idea that the National Rifle Association would dare mention putting armed guards in schools. Yet he sends his kids to a school with special on-call police officers. And of course, President Obama's children go to the same school. And I happen to believe that everyone's children are important, not just those who have money to pay for fancy schools. And then, of course, there's the worst of them all, former New York City mayor and billionaire Michael Bloomberg. Of course, Michael Bloomberg's been pushing for more gun control on a national level, and when asked by a reporter if he would be willing to give up his entourage of armed security detail in the name of gun control, the answer was an irritated no. So if the left and liberals really hate firearms so much, and the Second Amendment, then why do they act as hypocrites when it comes to arming those around them for protection? Because the answer is that the left isn't really interested in attacking the Second Amendment and firearms. It's really just about gaining control. Control is often the basis of their agenda, with the overall goal being the few people at the top, mostly in government, holding the power and making decisions for the rest of us. These people aren't living in reality because they can afford to pay someone else to protect them, and they're also liars. How many of you have heard about the modern day weapon problem here in America when you're listening to gun control debates? Modern day? Anyone? She just raised her hand. You heard that? Anyone else? Well, the argument is made that we have these high-powered modern day weapons that we have to abolish, right? Well, can anybody tell me when the AK-47 was created?
1946.
1947, very
No, it
close.
was put into production in 47.
Right, so produced in 1947. It's a long time ago, right? The AR-15 that we've heard so much about, the original design was created in 1968. So these things aren't necessarily so modern, right? Despite these narratives that are put out to the rest of us. People in the media often mix automatic and semi-automatic, and they treat people who know what they're talking about as inferior to them. And just for the record, automatic weapons have been banned or highly regulated since the 1930s. But with today's news reports, you might think otherwise. Another lie perpetuated by the media is that mass shootings and murders are always carried out with so-called assault rifles. You've probably heard all about the AR-15 firearms that have been used in a handful of mass shootings over the past 20 years, and therefore we must bring back the Clinton-era assault weapons ban. But while it is true that a handful of deranged killers have used an AR-15 to kill innocent people in gun-free zones, according to a report from the Department of Homeland Security, handguns are actually the weapon of choice for mass shooters. Although mass shootings and gun crime are down by half since 1992, a recent poll showed that Americans actually think that gun crime is up, and that's all thanks to the media. In addition to being all about control and spreading of false information about guns, the anti-gun crowd is also in many ways irresponsible. The Second Amendment and personal self-defense of the firearm requires an extreme level of personal responsibility, something we all know the left is not necessarily fond of, whether it's paying for their own birth control or taking it upon themselves to take responsibility for their own lives. They have a someone else will take care of it attitude. That's what the police are for. And that's maybe an argument that's made often. That's what the police are for. But with all due respect, let's take a look at whether the police are actually there to protect us. The Supreme Court ruled in 2005 that the police actually have zero obligation to protect you or to intervene in a violent situation. Not to mention, we've recently seen police say that they will no longer respond to robberies or less than pressing 911 calls in many big cities. The average response time for sexual assault in these big cities is more than an hour. So if you're a victim of a crime, trying to protect yourself before a crime is committed, are you willing to wait for the police to get there for an hour? Or do you think it'd be better and more efficient if you take care of the problem yourself? So these days, it isn't so much tyranny that we worry about, but crime and violent criminals who want to do us harm. They're our main concern, inside and outside of our homes. So the question has become, and this is something that's often debated, is do guns really equal less crime? And the answer is yes, but it is important to point out that more guns in the hands of law-abiding persons means less crime. We've heard a lot from the media and from uninformed commentators about America's so-called gun culture. And many in the media lump everyone who happens to own a gun or possess a gun into the same gun culture category, which is inaccurate. America actually has two main gun cultures, and it is important to distinguish one from the other. First gun culture is deeply seated in American history and her founding, as I briefly already mentioned. Founding fathers like George Washington understood that an armed citizenry would prevent government tyranny, which is why we have the Second Amendment. Historically in America, we've had a deep-rooted respect for firearms. The vast majority of people use them to celebrate American history, for collection, personal protection, hunting, shooting, sporting, and competition. In fact, the shooting sports is one of the oldest sports in America. We see gun culture celebrated each year when dads take their kids hunting for the first time. We see it when women head to the range to safely practice shooting their new pistol or their rifles. We see it when a mother shoots an intruder while she is home alone in order to protect her children. We see it practiced thousands of times each year when people sign up for gun and hunter safety courses all around the country. And not to mention, the multi-billion-dollar firearms industry employs millions of people and provides the government with billions of dollars in tax revenue each year. In fact, in the past 5 years, the economic impact of the firearms industry has doubled. In 2008, the total economic impact of the firearms industry was $19.1 billion, and just 5 years later, this number had increased by 97% to $37.7 billion. Further, the total number of full-time jobs rose from more than 166,000 to 245,000, which is a 48% increase. There are approximately 90 million gun owners and 100 million handguns in America. It doesn't even count the number of rifles in America. And each day, the vast majority of those gun owners use their guns properly. And that is the gun culture that we should be celebrating. The other gun culture in America can be found in the inner cities of Chicago, Washington, D.C., New York City, Los Angeles, and others. Ironically, violent gun culture is found within gangs and cities with the strictest gun laws. It is the same culture promoted in Hollywood films made by liberals and glorified by those whose music is worshipped in violent gang-plagued cities like Chicago. The breakdown of the family, lack of firearms education, and a missing respect for proper firearms use is to blame for a violent gun culture in addition to the individuals committing crimes. Gang violence rages out of control as criminals wield guns they bought out of the trunk of a car. The headlines read, 3 homicides in 3 days. Teenagers are 29% of homicides in Chicago. The same scenario can be seen in Washington, D.C., a city with arguably the second strictest gun control laws in the country. And of course, the crimes that get the most attention from the media are mass shootings, all of which, with the exception of one, over the past 2 decades, have occurred in a gun-free zone. I always find it so interesting that when violent perpetrators are confronted during their rampages by a good guy with a gun, they oftentimes immediately put a gun to their own heads and end things. We saw this in Sandy Hook. When the perpetrator there heard police sirens, he killed himself. He knew that good people with guns were coming to stop them, so he stopped himself. At Fort Hood in 2014, not the attack in 2009, in 2014, when the perpetrator was confronted by an armed woman with a gun, he killed himself before he even had time to pull the trigger, before she had time to pull the trigger. And on that note, I find it incredible that our men and women in uniform outside of military police and personnel aren't allowed, and security personnel aren't allowed to carry firearms in self-defense on their bases and posts. Survivors from both the 2009 Fort Hood attack and many soldiers from the 2014 Fort Hood attack have called for an end to the military's no weapons policy. There's a misconception that on military bases people have guns, when in fact the vast majority of people are unarmed. Quote, when our soldiers are unarmed, they will find themselves in a situation like 2014 and in 2009, Sergeant Howard Ray said, a survivor of the 2009 mass shooting in which 13 people were killed. Another soldier who was in the Fort Hood shooting in 2014 described things this way, quote, when will they allow those who have concealed weapons permits to carry them on post? We don't have a way to protect ourselves. We are all hostages when we are here. So if you look at current Defense Department policy, it says, the authorization to carry firearms shall be issued only to qualified personnel when there is a reasonable expectation that life or DoD assets will be jeopardized if firearms are not carried. It is unconscionable that as a policy, all of our soldiers are qualified to carry a firearm overseas and on the battlefield, but are left as sitting ducks when they are on their bases and posts here at home. How many people have to die defenseless on post until there is a reasonable expectation that life or DoD assets will be jeopardized if firearms are not carried? Do human lives count as DoD assets? I'd say that's the most valuable asset that DoD has. How long will we force our soldiers to run from a violent and armed perpetrator killing their friends, desperately climbing fences trying to get away? The perpetrator in the 2014 attack was able to run free for 15 minutes before he was confronted and stopped. We're lucky he didn't do more damage. On college campuses, where of course all of you walk around, men and women, but women in particular, have been put into an extremely vulnerable situation. Do any of you live off campus and walk to class? Most of you. That's the case with most college campuses I visit. So I went to the University of Arizona, and I remember when I lived in Tucson, every other weekend someone's house is getting broken into. It's a high crime city. There's not a lot of people watch when students leave and they break into your home. But if you're staying and going to summer school or taking a winter break class, they might think you're not home, but you actually are. And it really wasn't a comfortable situation knowing that someone could walk in when I was there home alone. And a lot of the time, because my roommates were gone, I was working on papers late at night, I was coming home late at night, and Tucson is actually a dark sky city, so there aren't a lot of street lights. And I felt much more comfortable knowing at home that if someone broke in, I could protect myself. But because I wasn't allowed to bring a gun to campus, and not even being allowed to leave it in my car at the time, and I think the policy here is different, I get home when it was dark, and getting in the door in a dark neighborhood at nighttime was pretty nerve-wracking. So luckily, nothing ever happened to me, thank God. But I do know someone who something did happen to as a result of anti-gun, gun-free zone policies. I want to tell you the story about Amanda Collins. She's a rape survivor, and while in college in 2007, she was raped 50 feet away from the campus police department office at the University of Nevada, Reno. And she was lucky to get out alive. Her attacker was a serial rapist who raped 2 other women and murdered another. He attacked Amanda at gunpoint in a gun-free zone. And at the time of the attack, Amanda was in possession of her concealed weapons permit, but was not in possession of her firearm due to university policies prohibiting carrying concealed weapons on campus. She was also a second-degree black belt at the time and walked to the parking garage with a large group of people, which is what all of the people tell you. You don't need a gun, you just need to take self-defense classes, and you just need to make sure you're with people a lot. Now, since that crime, Amanda has traveled the country to explain why comments about call boxes and rape whistles being sufficient self-defense for women on campus will only result in more unnecessary victims. During an interview, she said, quote, "If I had been carrying my gun that night, 2 other rapes would have been prevented and a young life would have been saved." All of these precautions are just sentiments that give us a false hope and sense of security. In my experience, I know that the university I attended, they didn't have call boxes the night I was attacked. They afterwards installed them. But I can tell you that a call box above my head while I was being straddled on the parking lot floor, being brutally raped, wouldn't have helped me one bit. In the safe zone I was in a safe zone, and my attacker didn't care. It's known that I could see the police cruisers less than 50 feet away from me from where I was being attacked. But the moment I saw those cruisers, I knew at the same time that no one was coming for me. They were all off duty, the offices had closed, they weren't in their cruisers, and no one was there. A whistle wouldn't have gotten anyone's attention because it was isolated and it was late at night. I was legislated into being a victim. So now that you've heard Amanda's story, let's talk about some of the things that the left and progressives have, who are against a woman's right to choose when it comes to defending herself, have suggested young women like Amanda do to prevent rape in gun-free zones. They've suggested everything from call boxes to rape whistles to the buddy system, which Amanda did in fact use, and at the very last minute, she had to break off to go to her car, and that's when it happened. University officials around the country and Democratic lawmakers have suggested women use what I call the 3 keys to protect themselves and to fight off an overbearing rapist: pens, peeing, and puking. They've actually told women if you're going to be raped, try to projectile vomit on them and maybe they'll stop. Tell them that you're on your period. Try to pee on them. These are actual things that they've told women to do instead of just allowing them to choose to carry a firearm responsibly to protect themselves. All of those things I just mentioned are less than effective. And although some of the advice they give is sound, universities don't provide advice for the worst case scenario. They never get to that final stage of explanation. They never tell you how to handle a situation on your own if help is unavailable, which it is most of the time. They also don't give you the ability to handle it on your own. In fact, they take away your ability to handle on your own. So after all that information, we come to one question. Does gun control work? Not in Chicago or Washington, D.C. It doesn't work in our schools to protect our students. And a gun-free movie theater didn't stop Aurora, Colorado. It hasn't really worked anywhere. Gun-free zones don't protect anyone from violent criminals. In fact, they give criminals the advantage, and legislation banning firearms, whether it's local or federal, doesn't work. Gun-free zones are not gun-free, as we've seen. So during the Clinton-era assault weapons ban between 1994 and 2004, not only did that law fail to reduce crime, but it also failed to reduce mass shootings. The Clinton Justice Department actually stated in a report about the effectiveness of the legislation, quote, "It failed to reduce the average number of victims per gun murder incident or multiple gunshot wound victims." And the same Justice Department concluded, "Under it, there has been no discernible reduction in the lethality and injuriousness of gun violence." So if gun control doesn't work, what does work to reduce crime? As every state in the union has implemented some form of concealed carry, the FBI has reported violent crime, meaning murder, forcible rape, robbery, and aggravated assault, is down for a 7th year in a row. FBI uniform crime reports show violent crime has been cut in half since 1992, and the murder rate has decreased by 54% since 1992 nationally. In December of 2012, the 7th Circuit Court of Appeals struck down Illinois' ban on concealed carry as unconstitutional, finally opening the door for residents in crime-ridden areas of Chicago and other parts of the state to protect themselves and their communities. And although permits must be approved by local police and a state licensing board, it's a start. And now that Illinois residents have finally been given their rights back, they're flocking to concealed carry classes, being responsible, to learn more about how to safely carry a firearm, how to operate a firearm, just in case they have to defend themselves from the people who are running their streets and the criminals who are running their streets in their neighborhoods. And since the concealed carry ban in Illinois was struck down, tens of thousands of applications have been submitted. Thousands of them have been approved, and only a few hundred have been rejected on grounds of legality. The state receives around 500 new applications per day, or did when this whole thing was implemented. All the applicants have to pass a criminal background check and a mental health check before they're approved for a permit. And according to the FBI, Americans use firearms in self-defense 2.1 billion times annually, and cases where firearms are used criminally amount to just over 500,000. 70% of those cases were carried out by criminal repeat offenders, which means that the criminal system is not working to keep people who violate gun laws in the first place in prison or jail so they don't do it again. In fact, just yesterday, President Obama commuted the sentences of people who had federal gun crimes on their record, proving once again he's not serious about actually reducing gun violence in the country. But going back to the self-defense cases, in the vast majority of those self-defense cases I mentioned, the citizen only has to brandish a gun, which means show it, not fire it, for the situation to stop, meaning there was no exchange. You pull out a firearm, the perpetrator runs away, the incident is over. In less than 8% of those self-defense cases will the citizen even wound their attacker, meaning they don't even have to fire a shot. The presence of a possible firearm as a concealment or the presence of a firearm being presented is enough to end a situation. It acts as a deterrent. 1.9 million of the self-defense cases involved handguns. So out of the 2.1, 1.9 million of them were handguns. And as many as 500,000 of those self-defense cases occurred away from home, which once again emphasizes the importance of concealed carry and being able to protect yourself both inside and outside of your home. 10% of those self-defense cases were women defending themselves against sexual abuse or assault, which I think is pretty important when it comes to women's rights. So when the logical argument based on data fails, we hear this question a lot. Well, why do you need AR-15s and other semi-automatic rifles? And why do you need a 30-round ammunition magazine, right? Well, first of all, the Second Amendment is not a right, or it's a right, it's not a need. So we have this conversation all the time in the media, and we have to indulge, but bottom line is it's a right, it's not a need, but we address the question. So going back to history, in history again for a moment, while everyday life in America is, compared to the rest of the world, is actually pretty easy and relatively safe. We live in one of the safest countries in the world. The reality is, though, that things can change overnight, regardless of whether you live in a decent neighborhood or a bad neighborhood. Take, for example, the Los Angeles riots in 1992, when business owners were forced to defend their property from angry mobs that caused severe chaos. $1 billion in property damage, 50 people dead, 4,000 injured, 3,000 fire set, and 1,100 buildings damaged. In this case, a handheld pistol was in no way sufficient, but semi-automatic rifles were. And business owners in LA's Koreatown knew what was coming their way, so they armed themselves with shotguns and semi-automatic rifles in order to defend their property. They stood on their rooftops as they watched the smoke pouring down the streets while the cops weren't around because they were in other neighborhoods dealing with problems. When the government breaks down, this is what happens. The cops only have so many resources to help certain people, and you might be the one that they're not going to be able to help. The bottom line with the LA riots was, there were a lot of people killed in the LA riots, but it wasn't by Korean shop owners protecting their property with assault weapons. In fact, assault weapons saved Koreatown, and it's fair to say that people holding them saved the lives of many people who were in those buildings that day. And then, of course, you fast forward about 10 years, a little more, to the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina in 2005, when New Orleans became a place of complete anarchy in a matter of hours. In addition to property owners being forced to stave off mobs of people roaming for food, water, and shelter to survive, as the government failed to provide emergency services, they had to protect themselves against dangerous looters. But not only were New Orleans residents forced to defend themselves against immediate threats to their person and property, residents also had to defend themselves from the government. As the water started to recede, leaving New Orleans a chaotic wasteland, police officers started going door to door, confiscating weapons. And who did they take them from? Mostly poor residents in New Orleans' 9th Ward. The New York Times reported in September 2005, no civilians in New Orleans will be allowed to carry pistols, shotguns, or other firearms, they reported. But the paper also pointed out, New York Times, that rich residents and business owners were allowed to hire hundreds of security guards with firearms to protect them. So sadly, the poor in New Orleans didn't have that same luxury. They took away everyone's right to defend themselves, and only the privileged were capable of doing so after the government came knocking on their doors. Fast forward again to 2013. It's a little bit of a different situation, when residents of Massachusetts learned that a bombing terrorist was on the loose in their neighborhood and running from police after the Boston Marathon bombing. They were told that he may try to enter homes and take hostages and that he was armed. And I said at the time, oh, okay, so the guy who bombed Boston is on the loose in my neighborhood? I'm super glad I don't have an AR-15 with 30-round mags who's going to come in my house and take hostages. Nobody says that when they're in a situation like that. You immediately go into survival mode and you want to protect your property and your family. And when asked in a poll, the majority of Americans said that if they were in the same situation, they'd want a gun in their home. Fast forward again, this has to do a little bit more with terrorism and the age that we live in. In 2014, a Somali refugee was arrested in Anaheim, California, and he was working and helping Al-Shabaab, which is the same terrorist group that carried out the gruesome Kenya mall attack the year before. Just to remind you, that attack happened when armed terrorists, took over a shopping mall full of unarmed civilians. It lasted for 80 hours. More than 70 people were killed, raped, tortured, beheaded, and dismembered. Now, we sure have a lot of malls in America, don't we? And they're all supposedly gun-free zones. This situation of what happened in Kenya forced police chiefs from all over the world to reconsider their pro-gun control strategies and policies because of what happened. I don't think I would want to be defenseless in any of those situations, because after all, when the Boston bomber was finally found inside of a boat by a citizen, not the police, despite Boston crawling with thousands of law enforcement officers from the federal level down to the local level, the police still had to be called by someone else. And so in the end, when seconds count, the cops are always minutes away. It's just a reality of the world that we live in. And that's if you're not in a big city where they deem you and not so pressing phone call. And the average home invasion is not just one person, but 2 to 3. So when politicians and gun grabbers and anti-gun advocates and gun control advocates and Michael Bloomberg's paid advocates tell us that we don't need semi-automatic assault or military-style weapons, and when they dictate to us about how many rounds we're allowed to have in our guns, they don't really know what they're talking about. Not to mention, this isn't really about need at all. It's about freedom, the freedom of choice and responsibility. 90 million Americans respectfully practice their Second Amendment rights every day, and that is something that we should be celebrating. There's an overwhelmingly respectful gun culture in America, and that is the one that we should be promoted and proliferated, and we should educate people into that type of gun culture. The violent and disrespectful gun culture in America is one that should be condemned and changed. So in closing, I just want to state that it's empowering to be responsible for your own safety and to exercise your Second Amendment rights as part of your proud American history. But most importantly, nobody has a right to turn you into a victim. And that's why you should have the choice to defend yourself with whatever firearm you choose. Thank you so much, and I think we'll probably do some questions if you.
Before you entertain any questions, Dr. De Rosa sent me here to take attendance. So those of you who know that you're here for this, write your name on a blank sheet of paper. Pass it over to the end for me. If you don't have paper, you can email me to that email. It's abruno10, ABRUN10. It's not just sending a name and a signature.
If we use the same paper that we're doing, at least you get one. Here, we study police response times and statistics, and it's not an hour.
In Chicago, New York.
You made it seem like it was in general.
I specifically said it in like Chicago and New York. But I appreciate that. Thanks for coming. Yes, sir.
What is your opinion on like Bloomberg's event programs and stuff, or Moms Demand Action?
Well, I have a lot of opinions about Moms Demand Action. Moms Demand Action shows up to rallies in armored vehicles, which will open the glass. And their argument is, well, we feel like people threaten us, so we need to defend ourselves. And I actually agree with them, so we can find some agreement there. But they oftentimes push false narratives and take advantage of situations without a lot of factual data behind them to exploit victims and to take away people's ability to defend themselves. And to just give you an example of how extreme they are, actually in the state of Virginia, Terry McAuliffe, who was actually a good friend of Hillary Clinton, recently condemned them and essentially disowned them after he dared to allow concealed carry permit holders from different states to have reciprocity in the state. This has been a long time, decades-long thing. And they attacked him for that, even though concealed carry holders are the safest gun owners in the country. So I would say that they're extremists, and they do not only women a disservice, moms a disservice, by promoting false narratives, but they also do the country a disservice by misleading them, oftentimes. Any more questions? Yes, Bernie?
Yeah,
You mentioned, you mentioned Chicago a lot.
Yeah.
That's where I'm from. I grew up in there. I've seen what goes on in Chicago, seen the gun violence, and it's a misnomer. Everyone says that Chicago has strict gun laws, and they do now. The majority of those guns came in when the gun laws were very relaxed. There wasn't a lot of guns. You could basically bring any weapon you wanted in there, and from what they'll hold it, they're still using the same exact weapons they brought in before. It's very different.
So you're saying that the police aren't confiscating enough firearms that are illegally held in the city of Chicago?
No, what I'm saying is, all these weapons that you talk about, that you said that Chicago has these strict gun laws, and look what goes on, it's a horrible place, look what goes on with all the violence, right?
It is a horrible place.
It
500 people a year get murdered.
Yeah, the South Side's absolutely terrible. It's awful.
Yeah.
But those strict gun laws, they actually don't have a correlation between the crime rates going up or down, is what the empirical evidence has shown that. That's what I'm trying to say. There's been no empirical studies proving your claim about what you're saying about the city of Chicago.
So my counter question to you would be, how do you explain states around the country and other cities, other big cities, that have relaxed gun laws and seen their gun violence?
I don't know. I've only studied Chicago. I don't know. I've only looked at the research
So
based on
if you
some
compare
Scott.
Chicago to other big cities like Houston, for example, which doesn't have the strict gun laws that you're discussing, which empower criminals rather than people who live in the neighborhoods that criminals are running, right? Criminals don't care about the laws, but the people who want to obey the laws and not go to jail, right, have a record, do. So the criminals know that in those neighborhoods that they can do whatever they want and that people are going to be defenseless. Good people. If you look at the statistics and you compare Chicago to Houston or Chicago to Dallas, and you look at the differences in laws, there is a correlation between the crime rate being lower when people are capable of defending themselves when they're not. And Chicago is an example of when there's more gun control, good people are put into a vulnerable victim situation. And in places like Houston, sure, there's still violence and there's gang violence, and that will always probably be a problem, and they're working on that. However, when good people who have to live in violent neighborhoods want to defend themselves, they're capable of doing it in a place like Houston, so the crime rate is lower.
Well, you also mentioned, you said, the court struck down the gun in Illinois, right?
I said they struck down the ban on concealed carry as unconstitutional
Yes. Crime rates went up.
in Chicago,
Yes.
right? But not in the neighborhoods surrounding Chicago.
No, they went up. No, there's one.
Not in
Look
the
at
neighborhoods
Cabrini,
surrounding
they went up in
Chicago.
Cabrini, they went up.
Look at Naperville. Look at-
Naperville went up as well.
Can you cite the number?
I can probably pull it up on the thing if you want me to
Where
talk
are
to
you
you. I
pulling
would
it
never
up?
talk to you. Because I grew up in that area.
Okay.
Believe me.
Gotcha. Well, I'm willing to accept your claim. However, it doesn't change the fact that Chicago still has very strict gun control laws. Right? The court striking down one constitutional carry or concealed carry law doesn't solve the problem of Chicago having extremely strict gun control laws. The other problem too is that Chicago also is not necessarily keeping the people in prison who they need to. So they're violating gun laws and they're getting released, and then what do they do again? They go violate more gun laws.
That's based on the recidivism factor in the prison system. Couldn't you say that's the problem with the criminal justice system rather than the gun laws?
It's both. So if you're going to have gun laws and you're not going to enforce them, then it's a problem with both.
I mean,
Oberman, hey, I have a question. So wouldn't you say the argument like for gun control is like really right now, like a lot of leftists want to like argue that it's like it scares people, stuff like that. The argument should really be more on like promoting safety.
Yeah.
And I feel like a lot of people like even people that are uncomfortable with guns because they weren't properly educated like growing up and stuff like that, they feel scared because if more people have guns out there, then the bad people have access to guns, and like if they don't want to have a gun, they still feel that they're in like some kind of harm's way.
Yeah.
Like, wouldn't you say we should like push more for gun education and
Absolutely.
safety rather than like
Absolutely.
being scared?
And I'm so glad that you brought that point up, because the fact is that bad people are always going to be able to have access to guns. This is a country that has hundreds of millions of guns. That's a fact. If a bad person wants to get their hands on a gun, they're going to be able to, and they're going to do it illegally. They're not going to obey the gun laws that we have, right? When it comes to education, the National Rifle Association sure takes a lot of hell from the media and from progressives and from the left as being this terrible organization that promotes gun violence, when in fact, it's the National Rifle Association that offers free gun safety classes in every single city in the country. They have thousands of firearm instructors who are willing to educate people who are willing to learn about firearm safety. And as I mentioned, when people are given the opportunity to take a concealed carry class, they want to because they want to be educated and responsible, right? So the education is actually available. It's just that the anti-gun crowds don't want to acknowledge that it's there. And I think that's unfortunate because education is always a good thing. So I'm glad that you brought it up. All right, I think we have time for one more question. Anyone has one? If not, no big deal. All right. Thanks for coming. I appreciate it.